Welcome to everyone for this session with the title Indices of Well-being, Indices of Peace, and I would like to start immediately with the projection of a very short video, by showing a very short video.
Il PIL, il prodotto interno lordo,
it might be the GDP, an index for the well-being of a country, maybe not. And since a few years, the world of economy is realizing that reducing to the mere GNP the status of the health of a country is something quite limited. Is a limited vision. There is a greater group of experts and civil society representatives who are thinking of focusing on a concept of equitable and sustainable index. And here we have the Human Development Index, the Better Life Index by the OECD, or the other indicators as developed by the Italian Statistical Institute. This is a major change of vision to start to include in the economic studies phenomena which weren't very much considered, like peace, social sustainability, vulnerability, and the trust and confidence and social capital. This is a new vision which is in a contradiction with the mere economic-based vision, and the individual is at its very center. Well, this very short introduction is extremely effective, and it introduced what we're going to talk about in this very session. We're going to listen to the presentation of two major experts. One is Professor Enrico Giovannini, Professor of Economic Statistics at the Sapienza University in Rome and former President of the ISTAT, the National Statistical Institute, and he was even Minister of Labor and Social Policy. And Professor Giovannini devoted a lot of his scientific activity to deal with the development of statistical instruments to measure the well-being. And then we have with us Dr. Steve Killelea from Australia. He is an entrepreneur, and certainly of a very successful entrepreneur in the area of innovation technology, but he is here because he devoted his entrepreneurial and managerial skills to develop some activities, philanthropic activities, and he founded the Charitable Foundation, a foundation which deals with the sustainable development and the promotion of peace. And finally, he even created a new institution which deals with economy and peace, and he developed an index to measure what countries are experiencing when approaching peace conditions. Before leaving the floor to Professor Giovannini, who unfortunately will have to present to us his contribution from a remote location. He's in Rome because he experienced some health problems. He couldn't be here with us. I would simply like to mention in a couple of words, which is the very meaning of this session. How, as it was explained in the video, it is growing and more widespread, the conviction that the measure of the GDP, the basically a measure telling us what has been produced and which is the income which has been distributed in the society, is not sufficient enough to measure the well-being of the very society, because it is just an instrumental measure. We are told the resources we have to generate well-being, but we don't know up to which extent we generated well-being and wealth. And so we have the need to develop measures and indexes so to take the society towards targets aiming at a better well-being, so to have better life conditions, happiness, and to spend a pleasant life. And war is obviously one of the basic negative determinants. Professor Giovannini, can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you. Welcome. I would like to ask you to explain to us the work you are doing to develop these indexes, these indexes which are complementary to the one of the GDP. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I apologize for not being able to be in person in Milan yesterday. I was dismissed from a hospital, and it was forbidden to me to reach you in Milan. I couldn't reach you in Milan. The subject is very important with the policies in the public sector, but even of the enterprises, by using a tool which is often used in these occasions. I would like you to close your eyes and for 20 seconds to think of the 3 things you would wish to the persons you love. The 3 aims which they should reach, hopefully, in their life. Well, if you have thought of becoming every day richer and richer, wealthier and wealthier, the GDP is your parameters, and so you can leave the room. But whilst if you thought, as it is often the case, of a good health, a good work, and hence a suitable income to live a full life and to guarantee a future to your children, to live in a healthy environment, and so on, then you will immediately understand that to measure the income which has been distributed is not sufficient. Although, we have to tell it immediately, in the last 30, 40 years, the income growth in developed countries, and now even in other countries, allowed everyone to improve the education and the quality of life in general. On the other side, having forgotten that there were social dimensions and social situations, these were such that our development models quite often destroyed the so-called natural capital available. They jeopardized the social capital, the relationships between people, and in sometimes they even generated untoward results, as mentioned by De Masi earlier on. For instance, in the United States, there are very concerning data. For instance, in the States, in terms of the inmate population or the type of violence experienced in a country like the US, whilst in Canada, not very far away, the situation is totally different. And so institutions are important, the institutions which are present in our society. And so after that many years of growth, the world wondered, and this before the recent economic crisis experienced in developed countries, whether running and racing that much to increase the income without thinking of environmental and social sustainability would have been the very best way to go on. And in the last 10 years, and I had the opportunity to work on these subjects, since the organization of the first World Forum focused on these subjects, which I organized in Palermo in 2004, various statistical data from OECD were used, and a lot has been done. And by the way, in the declaration about the future we would like to have in the so-called World Conference of Rio +20 in 2012, and this originated a process I'm going to refer to in a short while, the United Nations declared we have to overcome this indicator as an aggregate wealth indicator, and we have to look at many other dimensions. Many countries, and Italy as well, are now developing new initiatives focused on social and environmental and economic dimensions from a different point of view, and to look at two dimensions which are important as well, and they are both connected to the issue of sustainability. First, the sustainability which is connected with the disequality in the generations. The concept of equality has been really raped in certain countries, and we can even see the fruits in terms of social battles, of clashes, and so on. We know that many countries in the last 10 years, the income, 1%, the 1% rate, you have the disequalities in terms of the richest and the poorest countries. The inequality is something which has to be put at the center of our policies. And then the intergenerational equality, sustainability, the concept of sustainability, which, with the idea that a generation might obtain everything without jeopardizing the assets of the future generation. Well, unfortunately, in the last 40, 50 years, we experienced a development which destroyed the concept of sustainability. The future generations have been forgotten through the indebtedness of many countries, and Italy belongs to these countries, but even in terms of environmental protection, in these days in Italy we can see how much our territories are jeopardized. Woody Allen often, when makes a joke, he remembered Groucho Marx saying, I have to take care for the future generations. And this is a way to think of which is not present in our society. And today we know how much this way to approach the problem is rendering the present generation vulnerable. And so there are measures taken, but without necessarily changing the way to work, without changing the decision-making processes. Just think of the soil consumption which took place in our country, which generated risks which in the end were environmental disasters. But there are even those who are stressing that we have to build more and more. This change in mentality is taking place slowly. These initiatives in our country, and the one I took when I used to be the president of the ISTAT, to develop the eco-sustainable well-being indicators, which were included in the document of finance and economy in our government. It is recognized as an overall picture to verify whether these are adopted in our country. Well, if this is taking place in the different countries, is that next year the world, and this applies on developing countries and on industrialized countries, there will be the sustainable objectives which are going to be taken into consideration. And these objectives will replace the so-called the objectives of the Millennium Development Goals, which were established in the year 2000 for the UN Assembly for least developed countries. But if we look at other factors which take into consideration environmental and social problems of the overall institutions, then we have to acknowledge that we are all in the very same boat. Recently, an agreement between the US and China was established in terms of environmental emissions, is heading in towards the very same direction, and the government are negotiating internationally which are the aims which we have to reach. And so the good piece of news is, when considering the economic objectives or the basic objectives, I mean education for everyone, guaranteed health care, the sustainability of agriculture, the sustainability of industrial production of the tertiary sector, which have to reduce their environmental impact. We even have subjects like peace, the violence reduction, even in the countries, and the operational institutions. For the first time in this global agenda, all these dimensions are contained, which, when considering the discussions which is now ongoing in Italy, not necessarily they are important, ranking high in the political agenda. The media rarely devote some efforts to focus on these things. So this trend about these indications about the quarterly GDP trends, they are making headlines, 0.2, 0.1, small variations, which are making headlines on the media, when on the contrary there are other dimensions, well-being dimensions are quoted just when something special occurs. We have to keep the attention on this subject. We have to push the political agenda to look at the future and not just at the present, to avoid from the future generations, or we will face major problems. And hence, I'm going to reach the conclusion that the role of enterprises, of the businesses, are of basic importance, because if they won't change their approach in their production model, it will be very difficult to reduce the environmental impact. And by the way, there are even new concepts. The European Commission, the famous Europe, which we often see in negative terms. Well, the European Commission is promoting the idea of circulating economy, and maybe the new strategy, which is going to update the one of Europe 2020, the idea is to add an indicator so that the production will have to reduce in absolute values the quantity of raw materials used. We recycle very few, but today in certain sectors, it was discovered that by recycling products which have already been produced, there is a reduction in the environmental impact, but it even favors more employment, and costs are reduced. We are constantly talking about the cost of labor, but the cost of labor is represents 20% of the overall costs of a business, of a company. And so why don't we focus on the remaining 80% to reduce the environmental impact and to reduce even the risks which a poor energy autonomy might induce on the life of an economy and a society, which would then generate tensions like the one experienced with Russia. So, in conclusion, we need a different development model. We need a different development model which, putting the people at the very center and the relationships, will allow us to produce in a different manner, to increase employment and to provide sustainability. I don't know who, when I asked to close your eyes, thought of living in peace. I don't know how many of you thought of peace. Our society thinks of peace, the absence of violence, is a matter of fact, is something almost acquired forever. Unfortunately, this is not the case. We have to know that social tensions always caused tensions in this history of mankind, which often generated in violence. And we cannot think of this occurring never and never more. We know, based on various studies, we know that in the next 20 years, just because the energy resources are going to experience a reduction, we run the risk to have years of bitter wars to hamster the resources which are available, to hoard these resources. We need to enhance our capacity to overcome the tensions, to be able to talk about peace and sustainability, and even to consider the social dimensions. I really hope that this conference will help us in really perceiving the need for this paradigm shift. And some countries, with the inclusion of Germany, are approaching this direction. In Italy has now to do the concrete steps, so to let these measures becoming a guideline for the various behaviors, from political but even individual behaviors and individual actions done by the various enterprises and business. And so just in this case, we are going to overcome the criticism by Woody Allen and Groucho Marx, and we're going to support the future generations.
Thank you, Professor Giovannini. When I also tried to think of the three things, I didn't think of peace in the first place, even though we currently are in a very topical event, I mean science for peace. We, Italians, and also all of the younger generations that are here today, they didn't experience war firsthand. Well, you know, they tend to take for granted that they live in a peaceful environment. But if you consider that the last 70 years were free of war, as opposed to a past that was characterized by conflicts at all times, then we should start considering peace as a very precious asset in our continent as well. Now, I am extremely happy to give the floor. I am extremely honored to give the floor to Mr. Steve Killelea, an Australian, Steve Killelea, someone who decided to devote a good portion of his energy to develop these activities aimed at promoting peace. So, I would like to ask him to get into the details of the connection between peace and well-being and the roles that the role played by understanding how close or distant we are from a sort of peaceful conditions or peaceful setting.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm afraid my Italian is not as good as the rest of the audience, so I will have to speak in English. But I'm sure the translator will do an exceptionally good job on the translation. So a short presentation here. I realise we've run over time, so I do not want to bore you too much with a long and lengthy presentation, particularly seeing we have lunch coming. But you just have to bear with me. If we look at the problems facing the world today, all the major problems are global in nature. They're things like climate change, ever-decreasing biodiversity, full use fresh water on the planet, and underpinning all of them, overpopulation. And unless we have a world which is basically peaceful, we'll never get the levels of trust, cooperation, inclusiveness which are necessary to solve these problems. Therefore, I'd say peace is a prerequisite for the survival of society as we know it in the 21st century. And that, my friends, is different than in any other epoch in human history. In the past, peace may have been the domain of the altruistic, but in the 21st century, it's in everyone's self-interest. Therefore, if we do not focus on peace, what sort of future will we have? Now, I've got a problem with this presentation here. This flipper's not flipping it forward. Can someone help me? This is just not working. Got me the first slide, but I'm not getting past that. Okay, I think we're in business now. Now, there are many, many ways of being able to look at peace. How would you define peace? For most people in this room, what you'd think about is yourself, your personal peace. And that is very, very important. But how would you define that? Maybe the absence of afflictive emotion? But in the work we do, we work with two definitions of peace. And the definition you want for peace is dependent on the solution which you want. So the first one is the absence of violence or fear of violence, which is what's known as a negative definition of peace, but most people can agree on that. And then there's another concept of peace, which you could call positive peace. And it's something which is only just starting to gain momentum within the global world. And that is the attitudes, institutions and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. Now, we start to look at this. If you start to look at actual peace, the absence of violence or fear of violence, you can get that through measuring crime, the suppression of the state on its citizens, the amount of military expenditure you've got, or the conflicts or wars which you've got going on. From that, we produce an index called the Global Peace Index, and it ranks 162 different countries around the world. That covers 99.6% of the population of the world. Now, many people would say, well, if you know the peacefulness of a nation, you know how much crime or violence is there, so what? It tells you nothing about having to fix it. Okay, now that was interesting. He just took what looked like the battery out of the back. So, now, tell you nothing about how do you actually create peace. What's important is positive peace, is those attitudes, institutions and structures which create peaceful societies. But once you have a list of just how violent different nations are in the world, you can use statistical analysis to derive at what's termed positive peace. In other words, those factors which create peace. Once you've got that, you can now produce another index, which could be called a positive peace index. Now, when we look at those factors which actually create a peaceful society, and we've been through over about 8,000 different data sets, indexes and attitudinal surveys to find out what is statistically linked. They're things like well-functioning government, sound business environment, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, low levels of corruption, acceptance of the rights of others, high levels of human capital, good relationships with your neighbouring countries. And none of them is counterintuitive, but none of them is an actual causal factor in what creates peace. They're a system. They all come together and interlock, a bit like a brick wall. If you take one brick out of the wall, you lose 30-40% of the strength of the wall. So they come together and interface together to create peaceful societies. But what's more important is you look at these factors, they also create a whole lot of other things which we think are really important, like higher GDP growth, lower levels of inflation, environments which are more ecologically sound, perform better on gender equality, and also perform better on measures of well-being, happiness, and other measures. Therefore, in many ways, as we look at this framework, you can be describing the optimal environment for human potential to flourish. Now, if we look at peace, and we look at the two types of peace, the actual peace, and also we look at the positive peace, these societies all perform better economically. And if we take them back over time to 1996, that's a 2% higher GDP growth you get out of both measures of positive peace and also measures the actual peace of a society. So we can see that it's an enabling, a peaceful environment, it's an enabling environment for many, many other things we want. If we look at the cost of violence to the global economy, it's about $10 trillion in 2013. That's about 11% global GDP. And that's really an underestimation because we can only count what we can count. The real cost is probably 50, 100% more. Now, if we look at this as a conceptual framework, it also gives you the ability to be able to understand risk. So if you can measure violence, as I've already mentioned, you can understand positive peace. If you can understand positive peace, you can measure it. Now, by comparing the differential between the two, you can actually understand the risk of future falls in peace. So this is a fairly cluttered diagram, and it's really for those who understand statistics well. But if we look up on the far top left-hand side, we'll see countries like Laos, Zambia, Sierra Leone, Nepal, Tanzania. Now, these are countries where their peace is much, much stronger or higher than what their actual factors of peace say they should be. So they're actually enjoying more peace than they should. These are the countries which are actually at risk. So if we went back to 2008 and looked at the 30 countries which had what we'd call this positive peace deficit, 27 of them had actually fallen in peace by 2012. And this gives us a new way, a new paradigm of trying to understand where should we target developmental aid and what should be the process of doing that. It should be around the factors which actually create peaceful societies or positive peace. This we can now put into risk models. So I've just given you one risk model. There's another risk model which is called a like country model, and I won't go into the details of this because of time. But if we bring them together, it gives us the ability now to look at the countries which are at risk of falling in peace. And these would be the countries with the 10 countries which, out of our last analysis, have got the highest risks of small falling in peace. But we're not looking at conflict here. We're not looking at cataclysmic conflicts like Syria, let's say. These are countries which run a small to medium risk of deterioration in peace. And this again gives us an understanding of where we should actually be targeting our developmental aid to try and support and bring these societies up and make them strong before they end up in the kind of problems we see in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, and many, many others. Now, if you can actually take peace and you can measure peace, you can do things like looking into countries and seeing what the per capita income is, then seeing the number of people who are, let's say, living below $2 a day. You now know the risk. You now also know a quantum for a drop in peace. If that quantum happened, you can now look at the number of people who may drop below $1.20 a day if conflict actually increased. So these are examples, just a simple example of the practical outcomes of doing it. Now, I'm just pretty close to finishing up, but this is an exceptionally simple model. But I think we miss it, really miss it. We look at motivation and we look at skills. The combination of the two give us an outcome. So someone who's exceptionally well motivated, but with poor skills, you'll get ineffective outcomes. They'll be fairly useless. On the other hand, if you've got dark motivation and you've got exceptionally high skills, what do you think the outcomes will be? Those people really are quite dangerous. So when we're looking at sort of the motivating powers, we'll never get someone who's got the best motivation and the best skills. Those people are rare. But it's a combination of the two which we need, which gives the optimum level of outcomes if we're looking at trying to progress to a much more healthy and beneficial society. Now, if we start to think of the individual, we start to think of society. Does society create the individuals, or does the collective sum of the individuals create society? It's neither. So, individuals who are compassionate, empathetic, high levels of skills, good motivation, they'll affect the institutions and the systems we've got. Now, the institution and systems we've got have processes, governance, structures, laws, and, if done properly, are outcome driven. The two meld together to create a better system. And this we could see as sort of, rather than looking at causality, you look at a system, and a system which has got a momentum which is moving somewhere. Therefore, if you've got higher levels of compassion and skills within society, you're going to end up with better governance. The better governance will improve the quality of life. The quality of life then unleashes more human potential so that we can flourish. And from there, we come back and we have a more better skilled and a more compassionate society. So finally, if you can actually measure and analyse peace, you can actually understand the factors which create peace. If you can actually also measure and analyse peace, you can work out the economic value of lost opportunity. This now is actionable. Action gives you the ability to have better prediction, gives you better cost benefit, and above all, gives you better program outcomes. And that, my friends, is the end of this speech.